Yes, Richard.
Okay, sir, 54, 94, 54. What the heck? Thank you for having me here. Any submarine sailors in the group? You worked on them. I saw the USS Tecumseh on there, and you were a rep. So the USS Tecumseh was just a little tiny bit newer than the one I'm going to be talking about today. So my name is Richard Holmboe, and I'm going to ask you to cut me a little slack today because I'm going to be working from paper notes for the first time. And so I'm going to see if I can make this work. For 2 years, a submarine was my home. See, right off the bat, how do I make this go back? There we go, okay. And I use this one to go forward. No. The one in the So you see, you're going to really have to cut me some slack on this. So the name of the submarine was USS Baguera, and that was during the Vietnam War. In my 2 years, I made 2 trips to the Western Pacific, and my talk today is going to be about those 2 years. I'm going to be talking about the submarine itself, and I'm going to be talking about some of my experiences. Now, the title of my talk, My Submarine Life or Living on a Pig Boat, that pig boat part will become clear, I think, as I get shortly into the talk. Oh, it does work. So Baguera was one of over 200 submarines built by the U.S. during World War II. It was commissioned in 1944. I served on it between 1967 and 69. The Baguera was about 25 years old and thus nearing the end of its useful life. Submarines of this era were named mainly after fish. And they had common names for fish like the cod or the trout or the salmon. And when they ran out of the common names, they came up with obscure names like hackleback, clamagore, pampanito, and Baguera. And Baguera is the name of a California coastal perch. Baguera was a diesel-electric submarine at a time when nuclear submarines had already been around for about 15 years. And diesel-electric means that the propellers were driven by electric motors. And the electricity was produced by diesel engines driving electric generators. Oh boy, it's still doing that. In the Navy, we did not refer to submarines as ships. We called them boats. Baguera started out looking like the basic fleet boat in the top picture, and then after the war, Baguera received a conversion that made it somewhat faster, sleeker, more stealthy. So one of the first things they did in this conversion was they removed the deck guns. And then they added this streamlined, what we call the sail, around the periscopes and the conning tower. And the most important addition was they added a the snorkel conversion. She was charged at daytime from just below the surface of the water, but nonetheless submerged, and very difficult to see visually or even spot on radar. Basically, the snorkel system had 2 pipes. They had an air intake pipe, and they had an exhaust pipe. The air intake pipe had a very fast-acting valve, a shutoff valve, so that if a wave washed over the air intake pipe, the shutoff valve would shut it down fast, whomp. And if we were in choppy seas, then it was whomp and whomp and whomp and whomp. And the valve would shut the intake pipe, but those diesel engines kept sucking air. And that air came right out of the air we were breathing, and we felt it especially on our ears when that happened. And twice in my experience, I saw shipmates with blood running down their ears. Okay, the exhaust pipe now was just, that didn't work, did it? That's the snorkel intake up high. The exhaust pipe then was down low. It was just below the water surface, and this allowed the exhaust gases, the smoke, to dissipate somewhat in the water before it went out into the air. Now then, can you give me the next one, Jim? Okay, the natural environment for the Baguera was on the surface. In fact, a lot of people claim that submarines like the Baguera were not true submarines at all, but rather they were surface ships that had the ability to submerge. And so the Baguera did spend the majority of its time on the surface. And contrast that with nuclear submarines that spend the vast majority of their time submerged. See, I got a lot of things to juggle here. Now, this picture shows the sleeping compartment for most of the enlisted men on board Baguera. Baguera was small as Navy ships went, and so it was cramped and crowded, and it smelled. So diesel smell, the diesel fuel, permeated everything on board. We smelled it all the time. Of course, we got used to it, but it permeated everything, including our clothes. And I'll tell you, I took a uniform out of a drawer 10 years after I left Baguera, and it still smelled of diesel oil. Now, if not for the diesel smell, it might also smell like an outhouse. Our toilets emptied into a tank that we called a sanitary tank. And occasionally, we had to blow the contents overboard into the ocean. And we used compressed air to do that. But after they blew the sanitary tanks and shut all the valves again, they had to vent the excess compressed air, and that was vented inboard, and that's when it really smelled all over the submarine like an outhouse. Now, fresh water was at a premium. We could distill water from the sea, but that meant that the engine men who were manning the evaporators, they had to stand around those evaporators for 24 hours in 110-degree temperatures. So we were required to really minimize our use of water. We only showered once a week, and that was a Navy shower, and that meant that you would wet down and turn off the water, and you'd soap up and then rinse off, turn off the water very quickly, all the while minimizing the amount of fresh water. We could not wash our clothes, and we didn't have a lot of room to store a lot of clothes, and so we always joked that all of our clothes had four sides: the inside, the outside, the back side, the front side, and that we would wear one side until, well, we just couldn't do it any longer, and then we'd change sides. Humidity was often a problem, and especially in the warmer latitudes when we'd be submerged for several days, I'd crawl out of my bunk in the morning dripping with perspiration, and I'd crawl back in at night, and it's still clammy from the last night's sweat. So along with the diesel smell and the outhouse smell, we also had the sweaty smell. And then when submerged, carbon dioxide would build up. And it would build up to the point where we would start getting headaches and feeling fatigued and stuff like that. So we really looked forward to those times when we would surface and the engines would start running and draw fresh air through the boat, and same when we would snorkel. Now, this slide does show the main berthing compartment. And most of us had a bed, a bunk. It was about 2 feet by 6 feet, and I said most of us, because it was not terribly uncommon that when a young enlisted man reported aboard, there might not be a bunk for him. And so for a while he had to hot bunk. And that meant that he was issued a blanket and a pillow, and then he'd have to wait for somebody else to go on watch so that he could grab a nap in that guy's bunk. Now, you notice that these bunks had those green, they were vinyl covers. They'd zip up. And what that young guy would have to do is wrap himself in the blanket and lie down on top of the vinyl and get his sleep. I hot bunked my first week on Baguera. So a lot of people outside of our community would call this kind of submarine a pig boat, and for all the reasons I just mentioned. Now, we accepted these discomforts because we were told and we believed that we were elite. Whether we were or not is irrelevant. That's what we believed. Okay, let's see here. Okay, so these pins are worn on naval uniforms, the silver on enlisted men's uniforms, the gold on officers, and they tell the world that we were qualified in submarines. It's the quintessential point of pride for any submariner to wear these pins and to be recognized as qualified in submarines. Now, the pins themselves are called dolphins. They show two mahi-mahi dolphin fish resting their heads on the diving planes of a submarine. If you didn't wear the dolphins, if you were not qualified, then you were a non-qual, and the non-quals were the lowest form of life that we had on submarines. And non-quals were hassled, both officially and unofficially, in many ways. Officially, they were, their liberty was restricted. You know, whereas the qualified submarines might get off in a foreign port maybe at noon, a non-qual would maybe have to, or maybe they'd get off the boat maybe at 9 in the morning, but a non-qual couldn't get off until noon, and if he was behind on his qualification process, maybe not until 4 in the afternoon. So they were officially hassled in that way, and they were unofficially hassled in many other ways. If I spotted a non-qual sleeping during the daylight hours or the daytime, he might get rousted out of bed and told to go back working on qualifications, because that was his primary responsibility, to focus all of his spare time on qualifications. Now, the qualification process was pretty extensive. It was damnably extensive. It took 6 to 8 months to get through the process. In that time, you were tested on every system on board. You were tested 6 different times. And it didn't matter what your job code was. I mean, you might be a cook, but you had to know how to dive and surface the submarine. You had to know how to fire the torpedoes. You had to start up and shut down the engines. You had to know how to charge the batteries. You had to know all these things to become qualified. Now, once you're qualified, after you've gone through all this testing and you've passed them all, then the commanding officer, with true pomp and ceremony, would issue you your first set of dolphins. And at that point in time, the unofficial ceremonial took place. And typically, you'd get thrown overboard just to celebrate your achievement. And this was, we actually looked forward to this, because it truly was it was a big deal to get qualified. Now, these 3 gentlemen over here were shipmates of mine. The first 2 on the right had just gotten promoted, so they threw them over as well. And the handsome one on the left, well, he just got his dolphins, and so he got thrown aboard. Now, I'm going to tell you a little story, and this has nothing to do with the Baguera. It wasn't even my experience, but it's kind of a funny story. It was on the USS Amberjack, a submarine back in 1960. And on one day, 6 young members of the crew were qualified. And 6 of them got thrown overboard just as a Navy destroyer went sailing by. And the commanding officer of the Navy destroyer did not know this submarine tradition. So he blinked a signal to the Amberjack. He said, "What happened?" And the Amberjack blinked back, "Unshined shoes." Now, if any of you, those of you that have served in the military, that may not sound too far-fetched. Okay, so Baguera's trips to the Western Pacific were primarily to serve in the Vietnam War zone in the Gulf of Tonkin. We were in and out of the Gulf of Tonkin several times. However, Baguera was not there to fight the war. So I'm a Vietnam veteran, but I never fought the war. We were there for two primary purposes. One was to gather electronic intelligence, like radio signals and radar, so they could be evaluated by smarter people than us. And the other reason was to play anti-submarine war games with our own Navy destroyers, because there was no submarine war going on in the Gulf of Tonkin. But Navy destroyers, one of their responsibilities is to be qualified in anti-submarine warfare. So we were out there to help them remain proficient. Okay, one time when we were in the Gulf of Tonkin, we were awaiting an NBC news team to come on board. The NBC was doing a documentary on the Navy's role in Vietnam, and so just before that happened, just before the NBC crew came, there was a Soviet, quote, fishing boat that was tracking us for a full week before the NBC crew came on board. They were tracking us for a full week, and even if we would submerge and move around when we came up, they were right there. They were always right there. Now, I called them a fishing boat, but they did have a lot of antennas on board, and that kind of alerted us to the fact that they were probably an intelligence gathering boat. So just as the NBC crew was about to arrive on a helicopter, that boat came streaking right towards us as if in a game of chicken. And one of our destroyers came and cut him off, blocked him. I didn't mean to do that. Cut him off. And then we came around, and now we got him two sides, and then another destroyer came, and now we really had him corralled. And he wanted to look like he was perfectly innocent. And so just at that point in time, when we had him corralled, he started blasting loud music out of his PA system, and he started playing Sweet Georgia Brown. And none of us had a clue why he was playing Sweet Georgia Brown, but that's what happened. So at that point, the NBC crew continued taking video film from above. We broke away from the group, and we dove and we surfaced a couple of times so they could get pictures of it. And then they hovered over our deck and lowered the reporter and the cameraman onto our deck, and they stayed with us for 2 days, just getting a sense of what the Navy and the submarine force was doing in Vietnam. Now, I never felt threatened in Vietnam. I never felt threatened by the Vietnamese, the Red Chinese, or the Soviets. I never felt threatened. The one time, the scariest time, was near Taiwan, and we were threatened by an ally, and that being Taiwan. Okay. We made several stops in Taiwan, particularly in ports called Kaohsiung and Keelung. And I remember Kaohsiung particularly. Kaohsiung was a port where they raised a submarine net across the opening every night. They pinged loud sonar into the water. It would hurt the ears of any scuba diver that might be there. And they had big guns up on the hills around them pointing out to sea. That's pointing towards China. So Kaohsiung and all of Taiwan were really preparing for an invasion from China. And we were there as their ally. We were there to participate in some joint naval exercises. And one of those exercises had us surface one day just off the coast with half a dozen Taiwan frogmen, and we let them get into the water and swim into shore. They did whatever they were going to do, and then we surfaced again at night to pick them up. Now, let's see. When we surfaced, we were supposed to be there all alone. Nobody else was supposed to be there. But when we came up, we saw that there was a Taiwan gunboat there, a Navy gunboat, and it spotted us. And now I got to tell you something about when we were in Vietnam. When we were in and out of Vietnam, we wanted those excursions to be anonymous. So we painted out our numbers, and we did not fly the American flag. We were anonymous. Well, here we are now, just outside the Gulf of Tonkin. We're off the coast of Taiwan, And this this Taiwan gunboat is looking at us and wondering who the hell we are. And it blinked a signal to us, and it says, identify yourself. And our captain said, bullshit. He's not supposed to be here. And the gunboat blinked again and brought his guns around on us. And the captain said, don't reply. And he blinked a third time, and the captain says, oh, tell him who we are. And the disaster was averted. I was in the conning tower observing this firsthand, and so what I'm telling you is true. Now, this was the closest I ever came during the war being blown out of the water, and that by an ally. Okay, so now we're back in the Gulf of Tonkin again in Vietnam. We had to make a repair one day. So we came out of the Gulf, and we anchored in the port of Da Nang. And I was not involved in the repair, but none of us were allowed to leave the boat. And so we'd mill about doing different things. At one point, I was going past the radio room, and we could hear radio transmissions from medevac helicopters carrying soldiers from the battlefield to American hospital ships. And when we were up on deck, we could watch those helicopters pass right by us heading towards the hospital ships. And we could hear big guns going off in the distance, but close enough that we could hear them. So that was the closest to battle I ever came. Okay, now I'm going to tell you a story about conflict between our commanding officer and our executive officer. And I tell this story for two reasons. One, it's mildly interesting. And the second reason, it really helped a shipmate of mine. And I'll make that clear a little later on. So I'm not using real names. I'm going to call the captain, Captain Queeg, and I'm going to call the executive officer, Mr. Merrick. Captain Queeg went to an Ivy League school, and he was not a people person. Now, Mr. Merrick was what we called a Mustang. He started out as an enlisted man, worked his way up to the rank of lieutenant commander, and Mr. Merrick was a people person. Captain Queeg gave many harsh orders that was really destroying the morale on board. And Mr. Merrick would often go to bats for the crew. Queeg and Mr. Merrick would often butt heads, and this was going on right in front of us, because on a little submarine, you can't really find a place to have a private conversation. And I think Mr. Merrick was a capable officer. I think he was, but what do I know? I'm down here. You know, I don't know what's going on up there. But I think he was a capable officer. But I do know this, that one day in Hong Kong, our commanding officer, Captain Queeg, had to go home on emergency leave to attend to some kind of a personal family problem. And he had to sign a paper stipulating that Mr. Merrick was fully qualified to take command in his absence. Well, 2 months later, back in San Diego, Captain Queeg threw Mr. Merrick off the boat. He says, you're no longer my executive officer. I can't take this anymore. You're out of here. And he justified it by saying that Mr. Merrick was totally unqualified. Well, you can imagine that that would destroy Mr. Merrick's future career. So he went to the courts-martial and got them to convene a board of inquiry. They looked into the situation, and they found in favor of the captain, and they made a report and sent it up the chain of command to the Bureau of Naval Personnel in Washington, D.C. Now, remember I told you that my telling this story helped my shipmate. My shipmate was, he testified in that board of inquiry. He testified in it, and he said Captain Queeg intimidated him. Captain Queeg shouted at him. Captain Queeg was berating him to the point that he says, I did not speak forcefully as I wanted to in defense of Mr. Merrick. And he says, I've felt guilt about this for 30 years. I mean, extreme guilt. The man was an alcoholic, among other things, and partly due to this guilt that he was feeling. Well, now, I'm going to go back to the story, and we'll come back to my friend a little later. So the report of the Board of Inquiry went up the chain of command, got to the Bureau of Naval Personnel, and there was an admiral there that thought it looked fishy and sent it back down for review. And they convened a second Board of Inquiry. The second board found in favor of Mr. Merrick. And Captain Queeg was at the end of his tour as commanding officer. They transferred him to a desk job, and Mr. Merrick was allowed to go about his naval career after that. So I wrote a book about my experiences on Baguera about 25 years ago, and I told this story that I just related to you, and my friend who had felt so much guilt was profusely grateful to me for writing this down and providing it to him, because he did not know about the second board of inquiry. He had spent 30 years feeling guilt because he did not speak up forcefully enough for Mr. Merrick. But we find that Mr. Merrick, in fact, turned out okay. Okay, this slide shows sonar equipment on the Baguera. Now, I was an electronics technician, and as such, I maintained electronic equipment like radar, but not sonar. But as an electronics technician, I did operate sonar. I did stand watches operating sonar. And I was pretty good. My primary battle station was radar. I was a radar operator, so I was considered the best radar operator on board, and I was pretty good at all the others. And if that makes you think I feel big about myself, I'll share this with you, that I was a terrible repair technician. So there's some good and some bad. The primary weapon on a submarine like Baguera was a torpedo. I showed, let's see, we had 24 torpedoes on board. We had 16 torpedoes in the forward torpedo room and 8 torpedoes in the similar after torpedo room. And I show this picture for about 3 reasons. I wanted you to see just how big a torpedo is. I wanted you to see how it get it into the submarine. They slide it down this inclined chute to get it into the torpedo room. And I wanted you to see that in this kind of submarine, so much of the work in moving a big heavy torpedo and things like that around was brute force, just manual labor. And that's why I show that. So this is a picture of the forward torpedo room where there were 6 torpedo tubes. There were 4 more torpedo tubes in the after torpedo room. Of the 6 you see there, identified with the red dots on them, the 2 red dots on the bottom were actually below the walking deck. So if we were actually in a battle station situation, they would remove those deck plates, and they could fire torpedo from any of the 6 torpedo tubes. Both torpedo rooms, the forward and the after, had provisions for escape and for rescue. Baguera probably could survive down to about 800 feet before crushing. But the average depth of the Pacific Ocean is 14,000 feet, so any talk about rescue and escape were pretty academic. You notice that there were bunks, the green bunks, like in the other compartment. I hot bunked for my first week in the forward torpedo room. And those torpedoes, they are cold at night. Okay. Now we go to the conning tower. The conning tower is the smallest compartment on board. It sits up above all the rest of the compartments. The captain and I shared it as our battle station. He was in command, and I was on the radar. And we shared it with 5 other men. And so especially in the next picture, you'll see how cramped that can be. You're looking forward in the conning tower right now. You're looking forward, and you see the big white wheel there. Well, that's the steering wheel, and the helmsmen steer the Baguera from that wheel. So the term that's used in the Navy is you're conning. You're conning the ship. You're steering the ship. So you con the submarine from the conning tower, okay? Now we're looking aft from the same position, but now looking back into the back of the conning tower. The radar is on the left, the periscope's in the middle. Inside the yellow ring are the torpedo firing buttons. So you see the torpedoes are actually fired by the officers in the conning tower, not in the torpedo room. Okay, now here's another Captain Queeg story. And again, this took place in the conning tower. I was there for first-hand experience here. So Mr. Merrick was in the conning tower, and he was going through the process of determining what our position was in the ocean, locating us. And he would go up on the bridge, and he would use a sextant to measure the angles to the stars, and he would use Loran, our 1960s version of GPS, and he would do dead reckoning, and he put all this together, and he would determine where we were, and he would send a report down to the captain. And so he did. The position report was sent down to the captain, and very quickly the position report was sent back up to him. Now, he says normally, he says when the captain returns the position report, it's because he disagrees with the position. So Mr. Merrick recomputed everything, and it turned out to be essentially the same. And since the captain had already turned in for the night, Mr. Merrick says, I'll wait and talk to the captain in the morning. That was a big mistake. So in the morning, around 8 o'clock in the morning, Mr. Merrick was working on the morning position report. Let's see, before we get to that, I want to go backward just a little bit. I want to tell you something about what goes on in the conning tower at night. And this was nighttime. It was dark outside. All the lights are turned red. And you get some kind of sense of that here, just a bit of a sense of that. But all the lights are red because red lights don't ruin your night vision. If you had white lights on and your pupils, your iris is closed down, you go back up to the bridge to see what's going on, or you look through the periscope to see what's out there in the dark, you can't see anything. And so you use red lights because you can operate with red lights and it doesn't hurt anything. Well, we'll get back to the position report now. So the next morning, Mr. Merrick and I were up in the conning tower, and he was working on the morning position report, and the captain comes storming up the ladder and demanding to know why his 4 a.m. course change had not been implemented. Mr. Merrick says, I never received an order. And the captain said, yes, you did. I wrote it on the back of the position report last night. Well, they retrieved the position report, and sure enough, on the back of it was written the order to change course. It was written in red pencil, and you could not see it in the red lights last night. Now, the captain should have known better. He really should have, but he didn't take any responsibility for this mistake. Okay, just below the conning tower, at the bottom of this ladder that you see there towards the left, is the control room. The control room is where the dive and the surface is controlled. And those great big wheels there, the two white wheels, control the diving planes. And the diving planes are like rudders, but they're horizontal instead of vertical. The diving planes are like rudders. Now, like the rudder turns the direction you're facing, the rudder or the diving planes, give you a different angle as you want to go up and down. And then this thing on the right is the hull opening indicator panel. This is a panel that shows you the status of all kinds of hull openings. Now, that would be hatches, and that would involve sea valves. You had a red light and a green light for each one of those hull openings. And a red light indicated it was open. A green light indicated it was shut. And before we could dive, you had to have a completely green board. Everything had to be green. Now, because they were green and red, we called this the Christmas tree. Now, let's see. I got to go back to my notes now. Okay. So years after I left Baguera, years after, my wife and I toured a submarine up in Portland. And we walked into the control room, and the first thing she noticed was all the overhead lights were red. And she piped up, oh, it's rigged for red. There was a docent there who was very, very surprised that she knew the term, rigged for red. And then he started to explain the indicator panel. She said, oh, that's the Christmas tree. And that docent was very impressed, and I was proud because it told me that she listened to my stories and remembered. Okay, I was 20 years old when I went on my first Western Pacific deployment. I was on my own. I had a full-time adult job, and I was serving my country. I traveled and I saw the following places from right to left: Hawaii, Japan, the Philippines, Taiwan, Hong Kong, the Vietnam War Zone, and Bangkok, Thailand. And what a great experience this was for such a young man. Our first stop was in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. We were stationed in San Diego. Our first stop now was in Hawaii, and we all took training on escaping a sunken submarine. And this tower you see on the left contained a 200-foot tall column of water, and with entrances at 50 feet, 100 feet, and 200 feet. And we practiced, we learned to escape a submarine at the 50-foot level. We wore the stanky hood, as you see over here on the right. The stanky hood kept water out of our faces so that we could focus on expelling the air out of our lungs. Because as you're rising to the surface from down low, the air in your lungs is pressurized compared to sea level. So as you came up, you had to huff and puff that air out. We go ho, 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 all the way up. And of course, when we got to the surface, that stanky hood also provided us with a certain amount of buoyancy. And of course, in Hawaii, in Pearl Harbor, right next to Pearl Harbor, was Honolulu and Waikiki. Now, this picture shows we were in Kamakura, Japan, and we got to see the Great Buddha. It was during a beautiful cherry blossom festival. And this picture shows my 20-year-old self there in the middle. And the next several pictures are going to show that same 20-year-old. So here was in the Philippines, and I'm the guy in the middle with the funny hat on. In Bangkok, Thailand. Bangkok, Thailand has about 100 Buddhist temples. And I saw 5 maybe, or maybe 6, and I thought I'd seen enough. Until I got to the temple of the reclining Buddha. This recumbent Buddha is about 50 feet tall. It's 140 feet long, and it's completely covered with real gold. And so we were told that the Thailand government has gold mines that serve no other purpose than to provide gold for the Buddhist temples. This python in Bangkok had just finished lunch. Well, you don't think I'd let him do that if I thought it was hungry. Okay. Hong Kong was my favorite stop. So many of the ports we went to were dirty and smelly, and the water was oily. And but we get into Hong Kong, and the water was clear and blue. The air was pure. The hillsides were green. The buildings were white. I really loved Hong Kong. And then inside the red circle, as we look down from Victoria Peak, we see what was called Victoria Basin, and that's where the Baguera was tied up. And if you have good eyes, you can see it down there. And then finally, there was Da Nang. And I'm told Da Nang is not so much a place as Da Nang is the sound of bullets ricocheting off your helmet. Okay, in 1969, in August, my 3.5-year active duty, including 2 years on the Baguera, came to an end. I was a second-class petty officer, that's an E5, and the atom symbol that was there on my rating patch indicates that I was an electronics technician. And though I left the active Navy, I stayed in the Naval Reserve for a total of 22 years. And I retired in 1987 with the rank of E7, a Chief Petty Officer, and I had cross-rated to Aviation Electronics Technician, as is indicated by the atom symbol with wings on it, and I spent the second half of my naval career in naval air. Then in 1970, Baguera was decommissioned at Mare Island in Vallejo. And for 7 months, she sat next to a pier as the Navy removed hazardous materials, particularly the lead-acid batteries that were not only hazardous, but they were expensive and valuable. In 1971, Baguera embarked on its final voyage. She was towed up to the state of Washington, where she was to be used as a target for a new torpedo. Baguera never made it to that torpedo test because just outside the Strait of Juan de Fuca in Washington, she developed a leak and she sank to an 800-foot watery grave. And those of us, and I'm speaking for everybody, but I guess I can only speak for myself, those of us that called Baguera our home felt pretty good that she ended her life on her own terms and not being blown out of the water by a torpedo. Then almost 50 years later, in 2017, marine archaeologist Robert Ballard, he's the man who discovered the Titanic, he was mapping the floor, the sea floor of the Olympic Peninsula, and he was to spend a full day mapping the wreck of the Baguera. And I was invited as a former crew member to come up and watch the live feed from the remotely operated vehicle down below, the ROV. And I'm telling you, Baguera looked ever so much different to me than what I remembered. To begin with, of course, she was covered with all kinds of sea life. What do we call these things? Well, barnacles was not anemones and things like that. But the things that really caught my eye was our walking deck, our wooden walking deck that covered up pipes and cables. It's all gone. The walking deck was all gone. So all we saw were the exposed pipes and everything. The thing that surprised me the most was that 1/4-inch thick aluminum sail. That was the streamlining around the periscopes and the conning tower. That aluminum sail was gone, completely gone. Again, just eaten away by the salt water and the pressure. So what is this image that looks to me like a crusty old shark? Well, what it is the stern of the Baguera, and what you see there are torpedo tubes, and you see one of the stern diving planes, and you see one of the propellers. Okay. The torpedo tubes, the diving planes, and the propeller. Now, I thought if I showed you a picture of it, you'd get that. But that's the end of my talk. So I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions, then I'll take the questions right now. Yes, sir.